In the summer of 1695, the most powerful empire on earth put a price on one man's head. Not an army general, not a rebel king, not an enemy nation. A pirate. One single pirate who committed an act so audacious, so impossibly brazen, that it nearly brought the entire British Empire to its knees. He didn't just steal gold. He stole from an emperor. He stole from the most powerful ruler on the face of the earth. And then he vanished. No final battle, no public execution, no ship discovered burning at the bottom of the ocean, no gravestone, no confession, no body. Just silence. The British crown hunted him. The Mughal Empire demanded his head. Colonial governors across 4 continents received orders to watch for him. The world's most powerful trading company offered rewards that climbed higher than most men earned in a lifetime. And still, nothing. 300 years later, we still don't know what happened to Henry Avery. But here's the part that should unsettle you. We know what he did. We know what he took. We know that every single one of his crew members who stayed behind was eventually caught, tried, and hanged. But not Avery. And men who do what Henry Avery did, they don't just disappear. Empires don't let them, unless something far stranger happened instead. This is the story of the greatest pirate raid in recorded history, the first international manhunt ever launched, and the man who somehow walked away from both. To understand why Henry Avery's disappearance is so extraordinary, you first have to understand the world he lived in. It is the 1690s. The age of sail is at its absolute peak. Wooden warships carrying 80 guns and 500 men cross oceans that would swallow entire fleets without warning. Trade routes stretch from England to India to the Caribbean and back again, carrying silks, spices, ivory, and gold in quantities that would make modern billionaires envious. But wealth on the scale creates vulnerability on the scale. And where there is vulnerability, there are men willing to exploit it. The golden age of piracy is well underway. Pirates operate from hidden coves and island bases stretching across the Caribbean and into the Indian Ocean. Governors in far-flung colonies look the other way for the right price. Sailors who have spent years risking their lives for a captain's profit have decided that taking that profit for themselves is simply more efficient. But here's what most people misunderstand about this era. When most people think about pirates, they think about the Caribbean, black flags, buried treasure, rum. That's not where the real money was. The real money was in the Indian Ocean. Every year, the Mughal Empire, the wealthiest civilization on earth, sent its most sacred fleet on the Hajj route, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Nobles, merchants, members of the emperor's own court traveling with everything they owned. Gold, silver, gemstones, silk, ivory, the accumulated personal wealth of an empire moving through the water in wooden ships, and traveling with almost no effective military protection. Someone who knew the routes, the timing, the patterns, could take everything. Henry Avery knew all of it. Henry Avery was not born a pirate. He was born around 1659 in Devon, England, a coastal county that produced sailors the way other places produced farmers. The sea was not a choice for boys in Devon. It was simply what came next. Avery went to sea young. He worked merchant vessels, naval vessels, and eventually found himself in the complicated gray zone that defined so much of maritime employment in the 17th century. The space between legal privateer and outright pirate, a line so blurred it barely existed. By the early 1690s, he had accumulated something rare. Not treasure, not fame, knowledge. He knew trade routes the way a city dweller knows the streets of their neighborhood. He had studied the timing of Mughal fleets, the patterns of monsoon winds, the weak points in convoy protection. He had spent years quietly absorbing information that most sailors never thought to collect. and in 1694, he found himself first mate aboard a ship called the Charles II, contracted by Spanish merchants to raid French trading posts in the Caribbean. Legal piracy, essentially, dressed up in paperwork. The arrangement should have been straightforward, but the captain was incompetent. The contract was already unraveling. The men hadn't been paid in months. They were beginning to starve in harbor while the captain slept off his rum below decks. Avery looked at the situation. He looked at his crew. He looked at what he knew about the Indian Ocean. And he made a decision. May 7, 1694, the port of La Coruña, Spain, late evening. The mutiny happens without violence. That is the detail that tells you who Henry Avery was. A less intelligent man would have started with blood, secured the ship through fear, and spent the next 6 months watching his back. Avery understood something more fundamental. You don't need to terrify men who already want what you're offering. He had been quietly speaking with the crew for weeks. Not loudly, not recklessly. The right men in private, one conversation at a time. By the night of the mutiny, the outcome was already decided. The ship simply hadn't caught up to the decision yet. While the captain slept, Avery and his conspirators took control of the Charles II. When the captain woke, he found himself looking at a crew that had already chosen a different future without him. Avery offered him a choice. Take the small boat, go. Or stay and sail under new terms. The captain took the boat. Just like that, Henry Avery had his own ship. He renamed it the Fancy. He pointed its bow toward the Indian Ocean. And he began to wait. Avery spent the better part of a year preparing. He recruited additional vessels. By the time he positioned himself near the mouth of the Red Sea in the summer of 1695, he had 6 ships operating loosely together off the coast of Yemen, near a small island called Param. They were waiting for the Mogul fleet to emerge from the Red Sea on its return from Mecca. The intelligence Avery had gathered was accurate. The fleet was enormous. The timing was as predicted, and for a brief, agonizing period, it looked like the entire operation would fail. The pirate ships were caught in a dead calm, unable to maneuver while the bulk of the Mogul convoy passed safely out of reach. Most of the fleet slipped through, but not all of it. 2 ships fell behind. The first was a small convoy escort, quickly overpowered. The second was something that no pirate in that ocean had ever attacked before. The second was the Ganjai Sawai. Let's stop here for a moment, because you need to understand what Avery was looking at through his spyglass. The Ganjai Sawai was not simply a merchant vessel. It was the largest, most powerful ship in the entire Mogul fleet. It carried 80 cannons and 400 armed soldiers aboard. It was personally owned by Emperor Aurangzeb himself. At this moment in history, the ruler of the Mughal Empire, which controlled roughly 25% of global economic output and commanded an army of over 1 million men. The ship's name translates to exceeding treasure. That name was not metaphorical. Historians estimate the Ganjai Sawai was carrying somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 pounds of gold and silver. In modern terms, that translates to somewhere between $50 and $100 million in raw bullion alone, not counting the gems, the silk, the personal valuables of hundreds of wealthy passengers. Avery had 1 ship, 6 in total counting his loose alliance, but effectively 1 fighting vessel of any serious capability. He attacked anyway. This is the moment that defines Henry Avery. Not the brilliance of the plan, not the patience of the waiting. This moment, when he looked at the most heavily armed vessel in the Indian Ocean, calculated his odds, and ordered his crew to close the distance. The Ganjai Sawai fired first. Its own cannon misfired and exploded the gun itself. The lead soldier panicked and retreated below deck. And then the Fancy was alongside. The battle lasted 2 hours. What happened during those 2 hours is where history becomes difficult. The Mogul soldiers fought. Avery's men fought harder. The chaos of close-quarters combat between 400 defenders and a smaller crew of desperate, highly motivated attackers is something that official records only capture in the coldest possible language. What the documents don't capture, but what witness testimonies later described in harrowing detail, is the brutality that followed the Mogul flag coming down. Avery's crew later attempted to deny much of what witnesses reported. The witnesses were not believed. When the treasure holds were finally opened, what Avery's men found staggered them. Gold, silver, gemstones, enough to make every single man aboard wealthy beyond anything they had imagined on the night they signed up for this voyage. They loaded it onto the Fancy. Avery set sail. And somewhere in the next 72 hours, sailing away from the greatest crime he had just committed, he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He decided to disappear. When news of the raid reached shore, the reaction was unlike anything the British Empire had ever experienced. Emperor Aurangzeb's response was immediate and incandescent. His own ship, carrying members of his personal court, had been taken by European pirates. The humiliation was not merely financial. It was personal. It was political. It was an attack on the divine right of the most powerful ruler in the world. Aurangzeb moved with the decisiveness of a man who had spent decades expanding an empire through absolute force of will. He shut down every single British East India Company trading post in India. He arrested the company's senior officials in Surat. He had them chained in prison. He threatened to expel the English from India entirely. Understand what this meant. The British East India Company at this moment was not simply a trading business. It was the engine of England's entire economy. India represented the most profitable trade relationship England possessed. The spice routes, the textile trade, the accumulated commercial machinery of decades, all of it suddenly balanced on the rage of one emperor and the freedom of one pirate. The company's response was immediate and unprecedented. They issued a reward for Henry Avery. Then they doubled it. Then the Crown got involved. The Privy Council, the highest governmental body in England short of the monarch himself, issued a royal proclamation. Henry Avery was officially declared a pirate and an enemy of the Crown. The reward climbed to £500, then £1,000 at a time when a skilled craftsman earned perhaps £20 in an entire year. But here is what made this manhunt historically unique. It wasn't just England. The Mughal Empire, the East India Company, the English Crown, multiple colonial governors across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean simultaneously hunting the same man. Different nations, different legal systems, different motivations, all aligned toward one objective: find Henry Avery. By any reasonable historical measure, this was the first coordinated international manhunt ever launched. And for a while it almost worked. Avery made landfall in the Bahamas. Nassau in 1696 was exactly what you would expect from a port that had quietly become the preferred destination for men who needed to not be found. Pirates, smugglers, privateers of questionable legality, merchants willing to ask no questions about the origin of cargo. Nassau functioned as a kind of organized lawlessness, a place where money purchased whatever protection law could not provide. Governor Nicholas Trott of Nassau accepted a bribe. The bribe was the Fancy itself, plus a quantity of gold. In exchange, Avery's crew was allowed to disperse quietly. 113 men, scattered across the Caribbean and North America. Avery went with them. Or did he? Because this is where the story fractures. From this point forward, the trail doesn't simply go cold, it evaporates entirely. Avery's crew were not so careful. Throughout 1696, the arrests began. Men from Avery's crew were picked up in ports from Virginia to Ireland. Some made the fundamental mistake of spending their share of the treasure, which made them easy to identify. Some talked in taverns. Some were simply unlucky, recognized by someone who knew the reward on offer. 24 men were arrested in England alone. 6 of them were put on trial at the Old Bailey in London in October 1696. The trial was a spectacle. Crowds packed the courtroom. The charges included piracy and murder. The evidence was overwhelming. All 6 were convicted. All 6 were hanged at Execution Dock in Wapping, the traditional site for the execution of pirates, where the bodies were left to hang through 3 tides as a warning to every sailor who passed. But not Avery. Here is what makes his absence from that gallows so extraordinary. Avery committed the crime. He led the raid. He commanded the men who were convicted and executed. By every legal and moral standard of the era, he was the most culpable person alive, the one who deserved most to stand in that dock. And he wasn't there. While his crew dangled over the Thames, Henry Avery was somewhere else. Nobody knew where. Nobody could prove anything. And the world's most powerful empire couldn't do a single thing about it. When an empire cannot explain a disappearance, stories fill the silence. Henry Avery's absence from history created a vacuum, and that vacuum was quickly occupied by legend, speculation, myth, and most dangerously, hope. Hope that one man could actually beat the most powerful institutions on Earth. Walk away clean. Live the rest of his life on his own terms. In 1696, the same year his crew swung from the gallows, a play opened in London. It was called The Successful Pirate. It portrayed Avery as a heroic figure, a man of the people, bold and free. The audience loved it. The government was furious. They moved to ban the play, which naturally made it more popular. Chapbook's cheap printed pamphlets began circulating through London taverns and dockyards with fictionalized accounts of his adventures. Sailors read them. Unemployed men in coastal towns read them. Men who were angry at the same company that paid for the same navy hunting Avery read them. In the chapbooks, Avery had a palace on Madagascar. He commanded a fleet. He had married a Mogul princess. He had become a king beyond the reach of any European law. None of this was documented. Most of it was certainly invention. But the stories spread because people wanted them to be true. And that desire created a space where serious historical theories and popular mythology became impossible to separate. The first theory, and the most widely accepted for nearly 3 centuries, comes from a book published in 1724. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates claimed to know exactly what happened to Henry Avery. Johnson, widely believed by modern scholars to have been none other than Daniel Defoe himself, the man who wrote Robinson Crusoe, claimed that Avery sailed to Ireland after Nassau, then made his way quietly back to his hometown of Bideford in Devon, England. He arrived under a false name. He carried what remained of his share of the treasure, primarily gems and some coin. He tried to sell the gems. And that is where the story turns dark. The merchants he approached in Bideford recognized the value of what they were being offered. They also knew about the reward. They bought his goods for a fraction of their actual worth, threatening to turn him over to authorities if he complained or sought a better price elsewhere. Avery couldn't go to the law. He couldn't fight back publicly. He had no legal recourse, no allies he could safely contact, no way to convert his remaining wealth into usable currency without exposing himself. He died broke, in the same town where he was born, buried in an unmarked grave. If true, it is one of the most fitting punishments imaginable. The greatest pirate of his age, brought low not by naval warships or royal justice, but by ordinary greed, Men no more legally upstanding than he was, simply better positioned to exploit him. But here's the problem with this story. There is not a single piece of documentary evidence to confirm it. No burial record. No parish death notice. No account from anyone in Bideford who claimed to have known him. No merchant who recorded buying gems from a mysterious stranger. Nothing. The story first appears in print in 1724, nearly 30 years after Avery vanished, attributed to sources that Johnson never names. It may be true, or it may be exactly what you would write if you were trying to give the public a satisfying ending to a story that never actually had one. Because the man who almost certainly wrote it also wrote Robinson Crusoe. He was not a stranger to fiction that felt indistinguishable from fact. The second theory is considerably stranger. By the 1690s, a settlement had grown on the northeastern coast of Madagascar. Its name, or at least the name it acquired in legend, was Libertalia. The story goes like this. A group of pirates, escaped slaves, deserters, and outlaws from across the world had established something that functioned almost like an actual society on the remote Madagascan coast. A community with its own internal laws, its own economy, its own logic, operating completely outside the reach of any European government or legal system. A place where a royal proclamation from the Privy Council was simply a piece of paper that nobody had to acknowledge. According to some accounts, Henry Avery went there. Not simply to hide, to build. Some versions of the story claim Avery didn't merely seek refuge. He became a kind of leader. A pirate king ruling over a settlement of hundreds, creating a world with its own laws and customs, becoming precisely the king the London chapbooks had already decided he was. Historians remain deeply divided on how much of the Libertalia story is documented reality and how much is mythology. Here is what is not disputed. Madagascar was real. The pirate settlements there were real. The East India Company spent years and enormous resources trying to destroy them. They were organized. They were violent. They lasted far longer than any European authority wanted. If Avery sailed for Madagascar, he chose a destination that made strategic sense, a place where his gold could purchase loyalty and protection in ways it never could in England, a place where no warrant, no reward, no fleet of warships could easily reach him. A place, in other words, where Henry Avery could stop running and start living. The third theory is the one that historians rarely discuss. Not because it's unlikely, because it's unglamorous. Because it doesn't make for a satisfying story. Henry Avery might have simply settled down. Not in poverty, not in exile, not on a pirate island. Somewhere quiet, under a name nobody thought to check, in a town where nobody knew his face, living off a fortune distributed carefully enough that no single transaction ever attracted attention. A prosperous man, a comfortable house, a wife perhaps, a respectable local identity as a merchant or retired sailor or small landowner, a life that looked from every external angle entirely ordinary. The treasure from the Ganjai Sawai was large enough to support this kind of life for decades, even accounting for the share distributed among his crew and whatever bribes were paid along the way. And the world was much larger in 1696 than it is now. A man willing to completely reinvent himself, willing to abandon every previous connection, every relationship, every element of his old identity, willing to become someone else entirely and never look back. Such a man could simply stop existing. This is, in fact, precisely how the most successful fugitives throughout history have operated. Not running, not hiding, becoming someone new. Consider the evidence. Every man from Avery's crew who was caught shared a common characteristic. They couldn't stop being pirates. They spent conspicuously. They talked in the wrong taverns. They stayed in the same circles where people recognized them. They couldn't let go of who they had been. The last known member of Avery's crew to be arrested was apprehended 3 full years after the raid. Avery himself was never found. Not in 1696. Not in 1706. Not at any point before the trail ran cold and the world moved on. Here's what's worth sitting with. Henry Avery's raid didn't just steal gold. It exposed something the British Empire would have desperately preferred to keep hidden. The East India Company, the most powerful commercial entity on the face of the earth, was held hostage by one pirate for 3 years. Its officials were imprisoned by an Indian emperor, who held them directly responsible for the actions of a man the company couldn't catch. The Mughal Empire was forced to negotiate with the company not as equals, but as representatives of a state that could not control its own criminals. The company ultimately paid reparations to the Mughals just to get its trading rights restored. All of this because one man took a ship and walked away. The message was not lost on the men who came after. Bartholomew Roberts, Blackbeard, Charles Vane, the captains who defined the next generation of piracy read those chapbooks. They understood what was possible if you were bold enough, intelligent enough, and disciplined enough to know when to stop. Avery showed them the ceiling. He also showed them the door. For nearly 3 centuries, Henry Avery existed only in documents and legend. Then in 2022, something changed. A team of researchers announced the discovery of several coins in Rhode Island and the Carolinas that appeared to match the description of Mughal currency from the late 17th century. The coins bore the hallmarks of the Mughal mint. Their dating was consistent with the period immediately following the Ganj-i raid. And their geographic distribution, scattered across multiple American colonial sites along the eastern seaboard, is precisely consistent with what you would expect from 113 men from Avery's crew dispersing from Nassau in 1696. It is not proof. It is not a confession, not a gravestone, not a recovered treasure chest. But it is the closest thing to a physical trace of Henry Avery that archaeology has ever produced. Which means that somewhere in the soil of the American coast, the fingerprints of the world's most wanted pirate are still quietly surfacing, 3 centuries after the manhunt officially ended. The man himself remains somewhere else. Somewhere outside the archaeological record. Outside documented history. Outside the reach of every institution that wanted him dead. Before we reach the most chilling conclusion of this story, make sure you subscribe to Rogue Bilge and join our crew for more dark maritime mysteries, vanished ships, lost treasures, and the terrifying legends hidden beneath the waves. Hit the bell so you never miss a story from the deep. There is a particular kind of historical figure who haunts the record not by what they left behind, but by what they refused to leave. No monument, no grave, no confirmed final chapter. Henry Avery is that figure. He exists in the space between certainty and imagination, a man who was real enough to nearly collapse an empire and shadowy enough to walk away from the consequences, as though the rules of documented history simply didn't apply to him. And the legend he left behind is in some ways more powerful than any physical record could have been. Because a man with a known grave can be dismissed. A man with a documented end, whether that end is poverty in Devon or execution in London, can be categorized, filed, and forgotten. But a man who simply stops existing, that man stays alive in the imagination forever. That man becomes a question that refuses to close. What really happened to Henry Avery? We have exactly 3 credible theories, 1 unverified literary account, and 300 years of silence. Devon and destitution, the Defoe version, Neat, moralistic, satisfying, and almost entirely unsupported by evidence. Madagascar and the Pirate Republic. Romantic, historically plausible, and impossible to confirm or deny. The Quiet Disappearance. Unglamorous, entirely logical, and perfectly consistent with how the most successful fugitives in history have always operated. What all three share is this: in none of them does Henry Avery face justice. In none of them does the empire catch its man. The greatest maritime manhunt in history simply failed. So let's ask the question directly. Did Henry Avery win? By the standards of the era, by the standards of what normally happened to men who did what he did, yes, unambiguously. He committed the greatest pirate raid in recorded history. He walked away with a fortune beyond imagination. He triggered the first international manhunt ever launched. He forced the most powerful trading company on Earth to pay reparations to an emperor. And then he disappeared so completely that we are still, in the 21st century, sifting through the soil of colonial America, hopping to find a coin that might confirm he was there. Maybe Defoe was right, and he died broke in a Devon bedroom, cheated of everything he'd stolen, punished in the end by the same ordinary greed that built his legend. A fitting moral, a clean ending for a messy story. Maybe he sat on a beach in Madagascar, watching the same trade ships he used to hunt, growing old in a place where nobody knew his name and nobody cared. A man who found the one corner of the world where his past couldn't reach him. Or maybe, and this is the version the authorities who hunted him never wanted to acknowledge as possible, he won completely. He took the gold. He let the legend grow. He let other men carry the weight of his name while he quietly became someone else entirely. And then he lived out the rest of his days exactly as he chose, in exactly the place he chose, answerable to no one. The most wanted pirate in the world. Never found. The sea takes things, and it doesn't give them back. Ships cruise secrets, sometimes entire centuries. Somewhere beneath the documented surface of history, in perished records that were never written, in graves that were never marked, in conversations that were never overheard, the real story of Henry Avery still exists. We just can't reach it. And maybe that's exactly how he planned it. If you want to explore more stories of men and ships that disappeared from history and left nothing but questions behind, subscribe to Rogue Bilge. Every week, we go beneath the surface of maritime history and pull up the stories that were never meant to be found. The next one is already waiting.